Why did Gen X become so self-reliant? There's something unusual about a generation that doesn't try to explain itself. They don't flood social media with identity manifestos. They don't dominate culture wars. They don't constantly rebrand their trauma. They just function, and that quiet functioning has been mistaken for irrelevance. But here's the real question. Why did Gen X become this way? Why are they so self-reliant? So internally calibrated, so low drama compared to the generations on either side of them? Strength doesn't appear out of nowhere. It forms under pressure. So if we want to understand Gen X, we don't start with personality traits. We start with environment. Gen X was born into transition, not the hopeful expansion of the post-war boom, not the hyper-connected digital world of smartphones. Transition. In the 1970s and 80s, divorce rates climbed. Dual-income households became economic necessity. Corporate loyalty began to crack. Institutional trust started eroding. And millions of kids came home to empty houses, not metaphorically, literally. They were the latchkey generation. Now that phrase sounds nostalgic. Almost cute. But psychologically, it's significant. Because when a child regularly comes home to no supervision, something subtle shifts. You stop assuming someone will step in. You stop waiting. You start solving. At first it's small. Heat up food. Finish homework. Figure out why the sink is leaking. But repeated exposure to unsupervised problem-solving wires the brain differently. It builds what psychologists call internal locus of control, the belief that outcomes depend largely on your actions. Not because someone taught it, because the environment demanded it. If you didn't figure it out, nothing happened. There was no instant Google search, no YouTube tutorial, no Reddit thread. Trial and error wasn't motivational advice. It was infrastructure. And here's the key distinction. Millennials and Gen Z can be independent. But Gen X independence formed before digital scaffolding existed. When you have tools, independence feels assisted. When you don't, independence feels embodied. That difference matters. But self-reliance didn't form in isolation. It formed alongside instability. Gen X watched their parents devote decades to corporations that downsized them without hesitation. They saw loyalty dissolve in real time. That experience planted something powerful. Do not fuse your identity to a system that does not guarantee protection. So they built quiet autonomy. They didn't reject work. They just refused to worship it. They didn't necessarily preach work-life balance. They practiced it because they had already seen the cost of imbalance. And when you witness that cost early enough, it rewires ambition. Ambition becomes practical, not ideological. Secure income. Yes, total devotion. No, this wasn't rebellion. It was pattern recognition. There's another layer here that rarely gets discussed. Emotional containment. Gen X grew up before therapy language entered mainstream culture. Before holding space was common vocabulary. Before every emotional discomfort was dissected publicly. That doesn't mean they didn't feel deeply. It means they processed differently, often internally. When emotional validation isn't constantly mirrored back to you, you learn to regulate internally. Again, not because it's superior, because it was required. That builds steadiness, but it can also look like detachment, which is why Gen X is often misread. Quiet doesn't mean numb. It often means regulated. Let's escalate this. Self-reliance sounds admirable, but it has a shadow side. When you learn early not to expect rescue, you may also learn not to ask for help. When you solve everything alone, collaboration can feel inefficient. When you regulate internally, vulnerability can feel foreign. So these strengths are not romanticized virtues. They are adaptations. Every adaptation has a trade-off, and that's important, because generational analysis often turns into competition. Who's tougher? Who's softer? Who had it worse? That's the wrong frame. The better frame is, what pressure created which trait? Gen X pressure created autonomy. But autonomy often comes with isolation. That's the paradox. The same environmental conditioning that built competence also limited dependency. And dependency in healthy doses builds connection. So when we say Gen X is self-reliant, what we're really saying is this: they were shaped by absence of supervision, absence of institutional loyalty, absence of technological cushioning. Absence forces self-construction, and self-construction builds internal architecture. But it also means fewer external safety nets. Here's where this becomes broader than generational trivia. The world that shaped Gen X doesn't exist anymore. Children today are hyper-monitored. Information is instant. Institutions are questioned loudly rather than quietly, which means the same pressures are not being applied. And without pressure, the same traits don't form. That's not decline. It's environmental shift. Gen X wasn't better. They were forged in a particular type of uncertainty, and uncertainty builds specific strengths: calm under friction, low dependence on applause, tolerance for being unseen. Because when you grow up largely unseen, after school being unseen doesn't threaten you. It feels familiar, and familiarity feels safe. So when people say Gen X is overlooked, the irony is this: they are the only generation that doesn't seem bothered by being overlooked. Not because they lack ego, but because their identity was never built on spotlight. It was built on function, and function doesn't need applause. It just needs to work. That's the foundation. But self-reliance was only the first adaptation. Why Gen X became the bridge between two worlds. Here's something people rarely acknowledge about Gen X. They are the last generation who remembers the world before it accelerated. Not intellectually, physically. They remember memorizing phone numbers because you had to. They remember maps made of paper. They remember boredom that couldn't be escaped with a swipe. And then, almost overnight, everything changed. Email replaced memos. Cell phones replaced landlines. The internet replaced encyclopedias. Social media replaced privacy. Most generations are born into their dominant system. Gen X wasn't. They migrated. And migration builds a different kind of intelligence. Let's break that down. When you're born into a system, you take its rules for granted. Digital natives don't marvel at Wi-Fi. It's oxygen. But if you grow up analog and transition into digital adulthood, you develop comparative awareness. You understand both speeds, both communication styles, both realities. That dual fluency is psychologically significant because it builds cognitive flexibility. And cognitive flexibility is one of the strongest predictors of long-term adaptability. Gen X had to update their mental software repeatedly, from handwritten resumes to LinkedIn profiles, from fax machines to cloud storage, from in-person meetings to Zoom calls. They couldn't opt out. They were already in the workforce, so they adapted, not performatively, practically. And when adaptation becomes survival, it becomes automatic. That's why many Gen X professionals don't panic during tech shifts. They've experienced technological identity shifts before. They've watched entire industries digitize. They understand that tools change. Core competence doesn't. But here's the psychological tension. Being a bridge generation comes with displacement. You don't fully belong to the past. You don't fully belong to the future. Boomers see you as younger. Millennials see you as older. You're rarely centered in cultural conversations, which forces a different orientation. If you're not constantly being talked about, you develop internal reference points. You don't expect culture to revolve around you. You don't build identity through visibility. That's why Gen X often appears indifferent to generational spotlight debates. They were never positioned at the center to begin with. And when you grow up between louder narratives, you learn to operate without applause. Now let's escalate this. Bridge generations don't just adapt technologically. They absorb tension from both sides. Gen X inherited traditional expectations from their parents. Work hard. Be loyal. Don't complain. Keep your head down. Then they entered adulthood just as those promises fractured. Layoffs, recessions, Corporate restructuring. They saw the traditional script fail, but they weren't young enough to reject it entirely, so they modified it quietly. They kept the work ethic, but removed the blind loyalty. They respected institutions, but didn't worship them. They engaged technology, but didn't fuse identity to it. That in-between positioning builds moderation, and moderation rarely goes viral, but it stabilizes systems. There's another layer here. Analog childhood builds attention endurance. When entertainment is limited, you sit longer. You read longer. You wait longer. Delayed gratification isn't a productivity hack. It's the default setting. Digital adulthood, on the other hand, fragments attention. Constant notifications, rapid context switching, infinite content. Gen X had to adapt to this speed increase without being conditioned by it from birth. That creates a subtle advantage. They can function in fast systems, but they remember slow systems, which means they can toggle. Slow thinking when depth is required. Fast execution when speed is necessary. That toggle capacity is rare, because most generations are optimized for the environment they were raised in. Gen X was optimized for two. But dual optimization also creates quiet fatigue, because bridging requires translation. Translating old corporate culture to younger employees. Translating digital behavior to older executives. Explaining analog logic to digital natives. Explaining digital necessity to analog holdovers. They often serve as interpreters in workplaces and families, and interpreters rarely get credit. They just keep communication flowing. Now here's the deeper question. Why did this produce strength instead of confusion? Because repeated system shifts build tolerance for ambiguity. When rules change and you survive anyway, uncertainty loses its intimidation factor. Gen X matured during the Cold War's final phase, the fall of the Berlin Wall, economic recessions, technological revolutions. Instability wasn't theoretical, it was ambient. And when instability is ambient, you develop grounded pragmatism. Not optimism, not despair, pragmatism. What works now? That question replaces ideology, and pragmatism ages well. But here's the shadow side. Bridge generations can feel culturally invisible. Too old for youth-driven narratives. Too young for legacy reverence. When you're rarely centered, you learn not to expect recognition. That builds internal security, but it can also normalize emotional invisibility. Again, adaptation has trade-offs. Strength and solitude often grow from the same soil. So when people describe Gen X as steady, low drama, adaptable, technologically competent, but not obsessed, it's not random personality alignment. It's the byproduct of migration between eras. They understand a world without algorithms, and a world ruled by them. They remember when privacy was default, and when exposure became currency. That memory changes how you engage. You don't panic about change. You've seen change. You don't worship new systems blindly. You've watched systems fail. That's not cynicism. It's perspective. But perspective alone doesn't explain everything. Because one of the most defining Gen X traits isn't just adaptability. It's skepticism. And skepticism doesn't come from technology. It comes from betrayal. Why Gen X developed a built-in cultural detector. Here's something that separates Gen X from almost every generation before and after them. They don't automatically believe the story. Not the corporate story. Not the marketing story. Not even the inspirational story. And that didn't happen because they're negative. It happened because they watched the script break. Every generation has a formative disillusionment. For Gen X, it wasn't abstract. It was visible. They watched Watergate unfold on television the moment when institutional trust cracked publicly. They watched corporations downsize loyal employees after decades of service. They watched pensions disappear. They watched promises dissolve. And something subtle formed in the background. Authority is conditional. That belief doesn't make you rebellious. It makes you observant. If you grow up seeing trust broken repeatedly, your brain starts scanning for patterns. not out of paranoia, out of self-protection, and pattern recognition repeated over time becomes skepticism. Now compare that to generations shaped primarily by expansion or hyperconnectivity. Boomers were raised during economic growth and institutional strength. Millennials and Gen Z were raised during digital explosion, where information flows endlessly and narratives multiply rapidly. Gen X grew up in the middle of institutional erosion, which creates a different psychological stance. They don't assume systems are evil, but they don't assume they're benevolent either. They wait, they observe, they test. And that's why they often appear unimpressed by hype. Because hype is noise, and they've seen noise collapse before. Let's escalate this. The 80s and 90s weren't just transitional technologically. They were saturated culturally. Advertising intensified. Brand identity became a lifestyle. MTV culture amplified image over substance. And Gen X absorbed that environment during adolescence, the developmental stage where identity formation is most sensitive. But instead of fully merging with the spectacle, something else happened. Grunge culture emerged. Cynicism became aesthetic. Sellout became an insult. Why? Because they sensed overproduction. When you grow up surrounded by marketing saturation, while simultaneously watching institutional failure, your brain builds a filter. Not everything shiny is solid. Not every confident voice is credible. Not every leader deserves loyalty. This becomes automatic. They don't consciously think I'm skeptical. They just pause before believing. And in a world where attention is constantly harvested, that pause is power. But skepticism isn't just cultural. It's emotional. Gen X didn't grow up with algorithmic validation. No likes, no follower counts, no personal brand metrics. So when influencer culture exploded later, it felt foreign. Not immoral, just inflated. If your identity formed before external metrics measured your worth publicly, you don't instinctively equate visibility with value. You don't assume that because something is viral, it's meaningful. And that makes you resistant to collective emotional swings, which can be stabilizing, but also isolating, because modern culture often runs on synchronized enthusiasm, trends, movements, outrage cycles. If you're slow to emotionally synchronize, you appear detached. But from the inside, it doesn't feel detached. It feels deliberate. Here's where this becomes psychologically layered. Skepticism often grows from betrayal, but long-term betrayal can harden into cynicism. The difference is subtle. Skepticism asks questions. Cynicism assumes the worst. Most Gen X individuals operate in the first category. They don't dismiss automatically. They just don't buy instantly. And that distinction matters, because in the attention economy, immediacy is profitable. Pause is disruptive. When you don't immediately emotionally engage with marketing outrage or cultural momentum, you interrupt the cycle. You become harder to manipulate, and systems prefer predictability. But this detector didn't just form because of politics and corporate shifts. It formed because of analog experience. Before digital editing tools and curated feeds, authenticity was harder to fake at scale. Face-to-face interactions were default. Tone, body language, inconsistency, all visible in real time. You couldn't filter yourself endlessly before speaking. You couldn't erase awkwardness with a delete key. That environment builds social acuity. You learn to read people, not just words, signals, micro-expressions, hesitations. That translates later into cultural discernment. If something feels performative, they sense it. Not because they're superior, because they practiced reading unfiltered humans for decades. But there's a shadow here too. When your default stance is cautious belief, you can miss collective momentum. You can feel perpetually one step outside mass enthusiasm, which reinforces independence but weakens collective immersion. Again, adaptation creates strength and distance simultaneously. So when people say Gen X is hard to impress or doesn't get swept up in trends, that's not personality branding. It's conditioned filtration. They learned early that systems can collapse, marketing can lie, Institutions can shift, so they built internal evaluation metrics. Does this make sense? Is this consistent? What's the incentive behind this message? Those questions run quietly in the background. And in a world where influence is currency, quiet evaluation is a rare skill. But skepticism and adaptability don't fully explain Gen X, because one of their most defining traits isn't just filtration, it's boundaries. And boundaries formed from watching devotion go unrewarded. That's where we go next. Why Gen X built boundaries before boundaries were trendy. Here's something that often gets overlooked. Gen X didn't invent work-life balance as a hashtag. They absorbed it as a correction. They watched what happened when work became identity, and they decided quietly not to repeat it. To understand this, you have to look at the generational contract that came before them. Boomers were raised on a relatively stable promise. Commit to a company. Work hard. Climb steadily. Retire securely. For a time, that model worked. But by the time Gen X entered adolescence and early adulthood, that contract had already started cracking. Corporate restructuring, mass layoffs, outsourcing, downsizing. They saw parents who gave 20 or 30 years to a company walk out with a cardboard box. That image imprints. It reshapes loyalty, not into rebellion, into recalibration. Gen X didn't stop working hard. They just stopped fusing identity with employer. Work became functional, necessary, but not sacred. And when something stops being sacred, you stop sacrificing everything for it. That's why Gen X often set boundaries long before the word boundaries became cultural currency. They left the office when the work was done. They went to their kids' soccer game. They built hobbies that had nothing to do with status. They didn't answer emails at midnight to prove devotion, not because they were disengaged, because they were pragmatic. If loyalty is not reciprocated, overextension is irrational. That's not cynicism. That's pattern analysis. Now here's where it gets deeper. Gen X grew up during a cultural pivot from collective identity to individual responsibility. The social safety nets felt less stable. Institutions felt less guaranteed, which meant personal stability had to be self-constructed. And self-construction requires diversification. You don't invest everything in one system. You spread your anchors: family, friendships, side projects, personal interests. That diversification becomes psychological insulation. So when layoffs happen, identity doesn't collapse completely. There's something else to stand on, and that creates steadiness under disruption. But boundaries aren't just professional. They're emotional. Gen X was raised before emotional oversharing became normalized, before every internal struggle was externalized publicly. That doesn't mean they didn't struggle. It means they compartmentalized differently. They learned to handle things privately, which builds resilience, but can also build emotional isolation. Again, every strength carries a shadow. The ability to self-regulate without broadcasting pain can look like stability, but it can also prevent deeper vulnerability. That duality defines much of Gen X's psychological architecture. There's another layer here: scarcity. Gen X grew up with limits: limited entertainment, limited information, limited access. If the TV show wasn't on, you missed it. If the store didn't have it, you waited. If your bike broke, you fixed it. Scarcity builds resourcefulness, but it also builds appreciation for sufficiency. You don't expect infinite choice, so you don't experience decision fatigue at the same level. You work with what's available. And that mentality translates into adulthood. Budget constraints. You adjust. Market shifts. You pivot. Missing tools, you improvise. They don't wait for ideal conditions, because ideal conditions were never the default. Now contrast that with generations raised in abundance of access, unlimited content, on-demand everything, instant delivery. Abundance creates different strengths: speed, multitasking, rapid adaptation to trends, but it also reduces friction tolerance. Gen X built friction tolerance early. And friction tolerance creates composure when things go sideways. That's why, in crises, Gen X often appears calm. They've been operating under imperfect conditions their entire lives. Imperfection isn't alarming. It's baseline. Let's pull this together. Self-reliance came from absence. Adaptability came from technological migration. Skepticism came from institutional fracture. Boundaries came from watching loyalty dissolve. Resourcefulness came from scarcity. Internal security came from growing up before validation metrics. These aren't personality quirks. They are environmental imprints. And that's the part generational debates usually miss. No generation chooses its strengths. It inherits them from context. But here's the final tension. The same environment that built Gen X's steadiness also built their invisibility. They were the middle child of generational narratives. Not the largest voting bloc. Not the loudest cultural voice. Not the most digitally dominant. And being overlooked repeatedly builds a specific kind of security. If you don't expect attention, you don't depend on it. Which is why Gen X doesn't chase spotlight. They don't need to announce resilience. They just operate. Pay the bills. Raise the kids. Fix the problem. Move forward. Quiet competence rarely trends, but it stabilizes systems. And here's the broader insight. If you want to understand any generation, don't start with stereotypes. Start with pressure. Ask, what instability did they face? What promises broke? What tools did they lack? What systems shifted under their feet? Because strengths are just solutions to repeated problems. Gen X didn't set out to become self-reliant, skeptical, adaptable, resourceful, and boundary-driven. They were shaped that way. And if history repeats its cycles, and it always does, future generations will develop their own strengths under pressures we can't fully see yet. The real lesson isn't about which generation is strongest. It's about recognizing that capability is always forged quietly, long before it's named. And some of the most stable people in a system are the ones who learned early not to expect it to stay stable at all.